Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to Service Creation and Deployment from the Ground Up. My name's Stephen Barron. I'm a program manager on the Virtual Machine Manager team, and one of the major areas that I focus on are services and application deployment features that we have. Quick show of hands, it'll just help me with the content. How many folks are familiar with VMM 2008 R2? And with 2012? And with service templates and services in particular? Okay. Great. So when we look across Virtual Machine Manager 2012, sort of a broad view of it, we made lots of investments across the product. Infrastructure enhancements, fabric management, including new support for things like Citrix Zen Server, update management for patching your host clusters and your Hyper-V hosts in the VMM infrastructure. We introduced clearly this private cloud abstraction, which is one of the major investments we made in 2012. And finally, when we look at this last pillar, what we call services, this was another major investment for us. And I'll talk about why it was important for us to invest in what we call services and application deployment, and how we tried to address several limitations that we saw in 2008 R2. So we're going to focus on service templates, application deployment, custom or what we call generic command execution, and I'm really going to go through all the components that you can use in a service template and spend a lot of time walking through a number of service templates, from very simple single-tier, single-machine templates to deploy, say, an IIS server, up to a complex app like a stock trader app that we have, which is a 4-tier service, lots of application packages, lots of custom scripts going on, different tiers, application deployment orders, upgrade domains, and so forth. So when you leave the session, you should have a really good understanding of all the components that go into a service template, all the different things you can do with the service template, and most importantly, the fact that you don't have to have a 3, 4, 5, 6-tier application in order to gain benefits from using services in VMM. Again, single-tier, single-instance machines can greatly benefit by wrapping those templates inside of a service template. So in VMM 2008 R2, clearly we had virtual machine templates. And a virtual machine template was really a combination of 3 things. It was a disk, one or more disks. There was a hardware profile, which, just like it sounds, defines the hardware characteristics of the virtual machine, memory, processors, NICs, and so forth. And finally, a guest OS profile. And the guest OS profile was largely a set of things that would get configured at Windows specialization time. So instead of you having to craft your own custom unattend, we exposed these properties as first-class properties in what we called our guest OS profile, allowing you at VM provisioning time to specialize things like what's the computer name, what domain is it going to be joined to, and if you had other things that you wanted to set that we didn't expose in the guest OS profile, you could always attach a custom unattend, and we'd go ahead and merge those settings. And VM templates were great for deploying single, standalone machines. But when we looked at them as we were planning for 2012, we pointed out to ourselves 3 big limitations of VM templates. And the first one was, well, they were only good for single virtual machines at a time. And when we looked at lots of production workloads and even workloads in QA, typically business services are not running on a single machine, right? There's a number of machines that contribute to providing that business service. And you can think about a 2- or 3-tier application where you have a web tier for the app that has the user interface, maybe a mid-tier that does some business logic processing, and a data tier, probably running something like SQL Server. And even my web tier may have multiple machines behind a load balancer. Maybe my mid-tier has multiple machines. And even my data tier might have multiple machines because it might be a clustered SQL Server. And a standalone VM template from 2008 R2 didn't address the fact that you usually provisioned a collection of virtual machines to deliver some business service. So that was limitation number 1. Limitation number 2 was the in-guest configuration options that were available to you as part of a VM template were really limited to those things in the guest OS profile. So again, I could specialize things that were going to be taken care of at Windows specialization, computer name, domain join information, and so forth, but I couldn't really execute anything inside the guest, aside from the GUI run once command that we exposed to you. I really couldn't do any in-guest configuration, right? Things like roles and features, install an application. All of my work either was done by sysprepping things into the image itself. So if my application supported being sysprepped, I could do that. Or I had to log onto the machine or use some other solution to actually get my application deployed or my application components deployed inside that virtual machine. And the third limitation was VM template, VM creation from virtual machine templates in 2008 R2 is a fire and forget operation. And what I mean by that is when you deploy a virtual machine from a template, there's no relationship back to the template from which it was provisioned. So you don't know if it's changed over time. You don't know if it still matches the original template. And most importantly, if you misconfigured something in the template and deployed a bunch of virtual machines out there, there was no easy way for you to rectify it, short of logging onto each of those virtual machines and fixing the mistake that was made that happened to be in the template itself. So in 2012, we introduced a new type of template called a service template. VM templates are still present in 2012, and you can continue to use them. I hope when you leave this session, you won't want to use VM templates by themselves outside of wrapping them in a service template. And our service template allowed us to solve all three of those issues that I just pointed out. Number one, they can contain multiple machines, and we call those tiers, so I can define different tiers of my application. So maybe my web tier has a certain hardware configuration, a certain set of roles and features that it needs, and a certain collection of application packages. My mid-tier has maybe a different hardware configuration, different sets of roles and features, different types of application packages. And finally, my data tier has yet a third type of hardware configuration, and it has its own types of application packages. So that solves problem number one. You can use a service template to model multiple machines, right? All the types of machines that will contribute to delivering a particular business service to your end users. The second thing it did is we used service templates in conjunction with a new agent that we wrote to enable you to do a very rich set of in-guest configuration options. So we'll do things in the context of a service template like enable roles and features for Windows Server 2008 R2 and above. We'll allow you to install application packages. We have support for what we call 3 first-class application package types. I'll tell you why they're first class in a minute. That's Microsoft Web Deploy for IIS-based applications, Server App V. Server App V ships as a part of VMM 2012. And finally, SQL DAC packages, so data tier applications. The reason I call those first class is that we actually understand the metadata about those packages. So you drop them into our library, and if you have parameters that have been defined in the Web Deploy package, we can parse those parameters and allow you to specify them as what we call configurable service settings, meaning I want the end user to give me values at deployment time that I'll substitute when I'm installing the package, so maybe something like a connection string. Server App V will go ahead and parse the deployment config XML, and Server App V exposes a bunch of properties that they collect, registry, web config settings, so forth, dependent on the application. So we parse and expose those. And then SQL data tier applications, we understand the semantics around deploying, upgrading, and undeploying SQL data tier applications. So the next question I usually get is, well, that's great, but all my applications aren't actually leveraging any of these technologies, or certainly not leveraging all of them. So what's my story there? And we introduced a framework that we call generic command execution, where we allow you to put in the VMM library a folder, a standard Windows folder that has any number of artifacts in there. You append that folder with a .cr extension, and VMM will pull the folder itself into the library. It won't show you all the individual files, but now that folder is available for use in what we call a generic command execution. And what we allow you to do is execute scripts at various points during the provisioning process, either before any applications have been installed, or after all the applications have been installed, or before a particular application has been installed. And we'll take the contents of that script resource package, we'll inject it into the VM, and we allow you to then execute a script. So really, you can use generic command execution to install anything inside of a VM that can be done silently and in an unattended fashion. And we give you a bunch of options around that, and I'll walk through all those advanced settings of generic command execution. And finally, the third problem that I pointed out, this relationship or reference problem. Service templates, when you deploy an instance of a service from a template, that instance maintains a relationship, maintains a reference back to the template and the version of the template from which it was provisioned. And the way you update services is you copy the template, give it a new version, maybe it's version 2.0, make your changes. Maybe I enable some new roles and features, I have an updated application package, or maybe a new application package. I save the new template, and then I go and find my running instances, and I apply the new template to them. And when I apply that, what we're doing is we're going to diff the two templates, figure out what the differences are, and allow you to either make the changes immediately or defer them to some scheduled maintenance window when you want to actually apply them. And you can go forward with template versioning, where I want to deploy a new version of an application. You can go backwards, you can skip versions, you can just deploy a fresh instance of the latest version of the template, and I'll walk through all of those features as well. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is if there's questions as I'm going, I'm happy to take them during the course of the presentation. If it turns out there's too many at some point in time, I may ask you to defer. But if there are questions, please feel free to pipe up. So why would you use services? I hope you have a bunch of ideas already. But the three main benefits we look at with services are, one, you get to manage those multi-tier applications as a single unit. So they get deployed as a unit, you stop them as a unit, delete them, pause them, shut them down as a unit, all that good stuff. Two, you can mark certain tiers in your service template as scale-out tiers, and we have a new scale-out wizard that we introduced. So you could imagine that you could orchestrate with Orchestrator or use our performance and resource optimization integration with Ops Manager to enable auto scale-out. We don't have a scale-in feature. Scale-in for us is just delete a VM in a tier. And scale-out's pretty easy, right? It's not intrusive. You're kind of bringing up a new machine. It's going to look like all the other ones, and we'll put it into the load balancer if applicable. But scale-in is really a different beast, right? Scale-in is something you probably want to orchestrate. Something like, how would we even pick which instance of the tier we should decommission if we had a scale-in operation? So probably what you have is a workflow like, I'll find the machine that has the least number of connections. I'll pull it out of the load balancer. I'll wait until the connections drain below some acceptable level. Maybe I'll stop the machine or shut it down, wait some additional period of time, and then delete it. And that's why we don't have a scale-in operation. Again, it's just delete a VM for us. Finally, and this is really one of the biggest reasons to use services, one of the most compelling reasons, is you get this composability aspect between your OS images and the applications and the configuration that you want to do on top of those images. And what I mean by that is, when we spoke to lots of customers, turns out that many people wind up maintaining a whole slew of images in their environment. Right? They have a sysprepped image for an IIS server, a sysprepped image for a BizTalk server, a sysprepped image for a standard application server, a sysprepped image for a file server. The list goes on and on. First, it's a lot of images to maintain, and images usually aren't that small. And two, the maintenance overhead associated with images can be pretty large. So if you have to apply updates to those images, now you have, let's say, 8 images in my environment. I have to hydrate all of them, make my changes, re-sysprep it, and then decide how do I get the current instances that are out there updated, and how do I make sure that people use the right version of the image going forward. With a service template, you can define most, if not all, of your configuration for those VMs inside the template itself. And the template for us is just a database artifact, so it consumes very little space. And you could imagine that you could have a base Windows Server 2008 R2 image, no roles and features configured, no in-guest configuration done within the image itself. Define an IIS server template, a BizTalk server template, a file server template. Define all of your customizations, roles and features, configuration scripts, applications inside the template, and now you're only stuck managing one image, or maybe a couple images, right? Maybe an enterprise edition and a data center edition. And we'll allow you to mark application profiles as compatible with certain editions of operating systems. But it really reduces that image management that you have over time and gives you a lot of flexibility by taking advantage of composability between a base OS image and all of the subsequent configuration that you want to do, including application package deployment. So the service lifecycle management for us looks like this. The first step in the process clearly is to create a template. And the next step is to customize deployment. And we'll talk about configurable service settings in more depth in a couple minutes. But essentially, just about any place in the or many places in the service model, you can define what we call configurable service settings. And you denote them by an @ symbol, some variable name that you decide, and another @ symbol. So you can imagine that if I had a connection string that was exposed in my web deploy package, I want to take a service template and I want to deploy an instance of that service into multiple environments: dev, QA, staging, production. And the benefit of using the template is I know it gets provisioned the same way every time. But there are certain things that will change between environments. So in this case, maybe the only thing that changes is the connection string. So I can expose that connection string to my end users such that I'll receive the value of the connection string at deployment time, and we'll store that value that they've given us for that service instance. And I can use that same service template, deploy 4 different instances into 4 different environments, specify my connection string at deployment time, and I know that they've all been spun up the same other than the connection string. And we'll store that over time so that when you update the service, we don't have to ask you for the connection string every single time. Right? We'll just store that securely in the database, and you also have the opportunity to change it after the fact by going through the servicing wizard. And a great scenario for that is maybe I did my initial deployment, I fat-fingered the connection string. The last thing I want to do is have to delete the whole service and redeploy. I can walk through a simple wizard and I can reconfigure any configurable service setting that's been specified, and we'll go through and take care of changing that in every place in the model within the machines. So that's what we mean by customized deployment. This is where I get to specify things particular to the deployment of a service. Third, you deploy the service, and it gets provisioned, and all the machines get spun up, and if applicable, wired behind load balancers and so forth. And finally, as I spoke about just a couple minutes ago, the way I go ahead and update my services is by copying the template, making my changes, and then applying it to one or more running instances. So the template, of course, always the starting point. We built a new service designer that allows you to model your services, and that's where you construct service templates. You can drag existing VM templates into a service template, so you don't have to always start from scratch. The service template defines machines, tiers, and the connectivity of those tiers, including load balancer integration. So as you're probably aware, we have this great load balancer integration in VMM 2012 with things like big IPF5s. We have built-in support for Microsoft NLB, and we also have support for Citrix NetScalers. So you can put a service tier behind the load balancer, and then we'll take care of putting the machines in the load balancer, taking them out during servicing. You can define upgrade domains for a tier. So if I had, say, 4 instances in a web tier, and I told VMM that I want 2 upgrade domains, what that means is when I'm doing servicing, we'll pull 2 machines out of the load balancer, update them, put them back, and then move on to the next set of machines so that you can actually update your service without interruption to your end users. I mentioned this before. I'll mention it probably 18 more times throughout the conversation because it's really important to remember this. Deployed services are always linked to their templates. Once you have a single deployed instance of a service, the template that it is bound to is read-only because we don't want you making changes directly to that template. Right? We want you, again, copying it, updating it, then applying it. If you have templates that have no deployed instances, you can go ahead and delete them. But when there's a deployed instance, we don't allow you to edit or delete the service template to which that instance is pointing, because that's our source of truth for that service that's out there deployed in your environment. And typically when you're defining a service, when you're designing a service in the service designer, you don't have information like, well, which hosts would this service instance actually be deployed to, or which particular load balancer would I use? So really what you're doing in the designer is describing the characteristics, the capabilities, the requirements of those tier instance machines, and then at deployment time, we'll figure out with our intelligent placement algorithm what's the right host that meets those requirements, what's the right load balancer that has connectivity to that cloud or that particular host group that matches the requirements you've specified in the service designer. And clearly, if we can't find matching requirements in the environment to which you're deploying, placement will just give you good, sensible errors as to, well, I couldn't find a load balancer that matched your requirements, or no hosts available to meet the hardware requirements of your service tier. So now I'm going to start walking through some of the building blocks of service templates. First one we talked a little bit about, custom resources. Again, this is just a folder that you drop into a VMM library share. The folder has to end in a .cr for custom resource extension, and we'll bring that folder in and then make it available for use in service templates through the generic command execution environment. This allows you to not only deliver payload into the VM, so the whole contents of that folder, which could have 14 executables, a bunch of resource files, and then a single script that's going to go through and launch whatever executables and provide any configuration you want. We'll inject that payload into the VM. We'll run the script that you told us to run with the options. You can also specify the security context under which you want the script to run by using a VMM run as account for that. And if your script takes parameters, like we talked earlier about that connection string that I may want to get end user input for, you can actually model the parameters as configurable service settings also, so that the end user can provide you values that you then pass into the script. And you can use those service settings in multiple places. So if I needed to specify a SQL Server name, and I needed the end user to give me that information, and I was going to use it not only as the SQL Server name I was going to provision, but also as a connection string in a web config, and finally as a parameter to a script, we only ask the end user for that input one time, and then we can use that value throughout the model, any place you've defined that configurable service setting. And we include a couple of custom resources by default. So we include web deploy and server app v bits on our media, and when you install VMM and either add a library share or leverage the default library share, we will go ahead and deploy those custom resources into the library share so that they're available for you. If you're deploying an application with server app v, we give you install scripts off the bat, so you don't have to go and figure out your own. Same thing for web deploy. And we also have scripts to install the server app vSequencer, the agent, the PowerShell commandlets, with or without web deploy. SQL profiles. SQL 2008 R2 introduced this great feature that allows you to prepare an instance of SQL and then sysprep that prepared instance. And at deployment time, you need to complete the installation by providing configuration options like, is the SQL Server going to run in Windows mode or mixed mode for authentication purposes? What's the instance name that I actually want to complete? Who are the SQL admins going to be? Do I want TCP/IP and name pipes enabled and so forth? So VMM, what we did is we built a new type of profile called a SQL profile that allows you to take a prepared instance of SQL. So maybe I have an image in my library that has a prepared instance of SQL. I can customize the completion of that prepared instance by leveraging a SQL profile so that when the VM gets provisioned, we'll apply all the settings that you've told us to apply. Very much like an unattended scenario, if there's settings we haven't exposed in the SQL profile that you want to configure, you can give us a custom SQL configuration INI file, and we'll merge those settings with the settings in our SQL profile. And when the VM's done provisioned, it's a fully functioning SQL server, ready to receive data tier applications, ready to be managed, what have you. No logging in after the fact to have to complete the install. So we'll take care of that for you. I mentioned, I think, most of the properties that we expose, and I'll open up a SQL profile in the UI when we get to the first demo. When we talk to customers about SQL in particular, what we heard was, you know, that's great. I like being able to provision SQL servers, but it turns out that I don't actually provision a SQL server for every one of my business services. Usually what I do is I have 2 or 3 big SQL clusters out there in the environment, and they host databases for multiple applications. So we built another type of object called an application host, and the type of application host we have in VMM 2012 is only one type, and it's called SQL application host. And this allows me to deploy SQL data tier applications and execute T-SQL scripts against any SQL server in the environment, whether it's virtual, physical, clustered, managed by VMM, or not managed by VMM. So you can imagine that you could have several business services, several services you're deploying, all of them sharing a SQL server, and you just model that by using an application host. We have a compatibility type in the app profile that tells us if it's of type SQL application host or not. If it is of type SQL application host, it can only contain SQL data tier applications and SQL scripts. It can't contain web deploy packages or any other generic command execution scripts. Why? Because we don't have an agent on the SQL device. We may not even be managing that SQL server. And likely the person doing the deployment doesn't have admin access to the SQL server anyways, right? They probably have a limited set of capabilities that allow them to deploy databases and manage certain databases. The nice thing about the SQL application host also is the computer name can be a configurable service setting, meaning I want to prompt the user at deployment time for which SQL server am I going to deploy these applications to, which SQL server am I going to execute these T-SQL scripts against. We've talked a bunch about configurable service settings already. Again, we have lots of places in the model where we allow you to leverage these, and they're denoted by an @ variable name, @ nomenclature. You can mark them as mandatory or optional. You can mark them as encrypted, and you can give them a default value. So maybe I have a timeout setting that winds up going into my web config, and I want my end user to provide that timeout setting because maybe it differs depending on the environment. Maybe it's longer in QA for test purposes, but I want to give them a sensible default. So I can provide a default value of, say, 120 and allow them the ability to override it. And we include some predefined service settings that are available that if you use them, we don't prompt the end user. This is information that we have by virtue of being the management solution. So something like @computername@ is a built-in service setting that we have available to you. You could use that as potentially a parameter to a script where you need to know the computer name on which that script is executing, but you don't know it ahead of time, right? So you can't hard code it into the script. You can use that configurable service setting, and we'll retrieve that value at management time and then pass it into your script. This is what the Service Designer looks like, included in the deck for reference purposes. We're going to open up the Service Designer in my VMM system in just a few minutes, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this slide. It's got the ribbon. It's got a designer canvas where you can model multiple tiers. This is a 3-tier model of a pet shop application. And finally, properties of whichever object you happen to be focused on within the designer. So even for standalone virtual machines that may not be taking advantage of any services-related features like application deployment, role feature enablement, the recommendation is always to still wrap those in a service template. And the reason is Once you've deployed a standalone VM from a VM template, you can never retrofit that VM to be part of a service. So it will forever not have access to in-guest configuration features. But if you've deployed it as part of a service template, even if it hasn't done any in-guest configuration, you always have the opportunity to copy that template, make changes, and then apply it out there and take advantage of things like roles and features, execute a script, deploy an application package. And there's no harm to deploying a standalone VM inside of a service template. It just sort of future-proofs you should you decide to take advantage of some of these features going forward. So you can wrap your VM template that's standard OS profile hardware config, no in-guest, no services, specific features inside of a service template, and you just drag it into the designer and deploy an instance from it. And it's just, again, hardware and OS, nothing special. But you have the opportunity now to go back, copy that template, add things like roles and features, maybe an application package, go ahead and either service or deploy a new machine and start taking advantage of those features and deploy multiple machines, whether they're separate service instances or scaling out a tier of a particular service. So again, deploying from a service template at least guarantees that you'll have the opportunity to take advantage of those features should you choose to do so. Once you've deployed a standalone VM, you can never go back and retrofit it to be a service or part of a service. Question? Yeah, so the question was, is there any chance to pick up existing VMs and add them to a service? It's something we're discussing, something that we feel there is a need for, but yes. Absolutely. That's a prime scenario. The comment was, well, I already have a bunch of VMs deployed in VMM 2008 R2. After I upgrade, how do I get those to be part of a service to take advantage of these features? Nothing for VMM 2012 RTM. But it is a feature that we're discussing for future implementation possibly, because we do recognize there are lots of scenarios where you may want to add an existing VM into a service. So I'm going to walk through all the new components that we built as part of designing a service template. We have the existing objects from VMM 2008 R2, so VHDs, VM templates, hardware profile, guest OS profile. Those don't go anywhere. They're still available for use. We added a computer tier object. And a computer tier, again, is really just a VM template underneath the covers. And I can have multiple computer tiers in a particular service, so maybe a web tier and a data tier. We have, obviously, the service template that encapsulates all this. And then we added a new type of profile called an application profile. And this is what allows you to add application packages like web deploy, server app v, SQL data tier, and also where you add any custom scripts you want to execute. The application profile can have one or more what we call application deployments. So I can use, in a single app profile, I can deploy 6 web deploy packages, 2 server app v packages, 18 databases, and execute pre-install and post-install scripts for every one of them. Question? The question was, can we put like a config manager task sequence inside the app profile? The answer is no. There's no config manager specific integration here. We don't have what I would call a task sequencer. We have an order in which we will do installations, and we allow you to specify certain orders for scripting purposes, but I wouldn't say it's directly comparable to the task sequencer and config manager. So again, one or more application deployments as part of a profile, and those extensibility points, what we call pre- and post-install GCEs. And you can specify those at the overall application profile level, so pre-install in that case means before any applications have been installed, execute this script, or post-install. And for any individual application, you can specify pre and post. So before you install this particular application package, this web deploy package, execute this script. And after you've installed this particular application package, execute this script. Guest OS profile, we added roles and features, so that's where you configure those. And we added the SQL profile that I talked about, which allows you to specialize, complete a prepared instance of SQL. And that can have a SQL deployment, and you could specialize multiple instances of SQL on a single box. The application host profile I talked about, that's where I want to deploy data tier applications to an existing SQL server. That's the only type of app host we have currently in RTM. That has an application profile, and that can only contain, again, data tier applications and T-SQL scripts. And finally, we have settings at the service template level. These are the configurable service settings that you've modeled inside the template. So again, customizing deployment allows you to specify any configurable service settings, override a generated computer name that we may have generated for you, specify an admin password, any application-specific settings, and that's really key to allowing you to use a single service template for deployment of instances into multiple environments, is the ability to specialize certain things at deployment time, and again, we'll store all those specialization values on a per instance basis.
You usually have separate staging and production environments, fully separated. Where do you run typically VMM that can actually work with both?
So the question was,
Separate passwords for everything. They're not talking to each other usually, so how would you deploy?
right, the question was, I have different separated environments for staging and production. They don't have connectivity. They have different passwords. So you would model anything that's specific to the environment of a service that's being deployed as a service setting, and then get end user input at deployment time. Now, if you had multiple VMM servers, if you had a VMM server for prod and one for staging, we introduced the ability to import and export templates with VMM 2012. So you can imagine that you might do your service template authoring and validation in your pre-production environment, export those templates along with one or more physical resources, and import the template into your production VMM environment. Maybe you don't want to export and import the VHD because you know it's just a base OS VHD that's available in each environment. So during import time, we give you the opportunity and the ability to map resources to resources that already exist in the target VMM server. Or you can bring along physical resources. And there's a session tomorrow that talks about import-export in depth. So the deployment preview in the top left is where you see the space that I'm going to ask the end user for some input, like what's the mid-tier computer name, what's the pet shop password, what's the the pet shop user in SQL, and so forth. And again, those are values we're getting from the end user to complete that deployment. So those are the settings to override and a deploy service button. So what does the deployment look like? What we'll do is, based on the application deployment order that's been specified, we'll choose the tier that has the first application deployment order. If they all have the same application deployment order, the applications will be done in parallel. The one thing to note is application deployment order influences exactly what it sounds like. Only the installation of the applications. We'll spin up all the machines in parallel. We'll specialize them in parallel. And then we'll stagger the application deployment order based on what you've told us to do. So if you're deploying a 6-instance service, we're not going to serialize the deployment of the VMs. We're actually going to create all 6 VMs in parallel, specialize the operating system, and then tackle the application deployments in the order you've specified. So we'll select the tier. We'll create the new VM from the template. We power it on and wait for the VM. The VM will go ahead and get specialized, so Windows specialization. We'll inject our VMM guest agent after Windows specialization is done. And then we'll execute any profile level scripts that you've identified in your application profile. We'll install any applications that are there, execute any post-install scripts. If applicable, add that instance to the load balancer, and then we're done and we'd move on to the next application deployment order. The other thing we did, and this changed after our beta release, is we give you the ability directly within the VMM UI to actually see the applications that have been deployed by us, the first-class ones, Server App V, SQL Data Tier apps, and Web Deploy. And the really, I think, useful thing about this is not only can I see the applications, I can see the settings that were used for that application. And if they were marked encrypted, we're going to mask them out, as you can see in the bottom properties pane. But that allows me to easily see something like, well, I deployed the app, it's not working. Let me look at the properties. Oh, maybe I misconfigured the connection string. Instead of having to go and log into the machine, find the web config, find out where that connection string setting is stored, I can see all the settings that were used at deployment time right within the VMM UI, along with, again, the applications that have been deployed inside that instance. So you have your service, you have instance applications, and then depending on what's selected, again, in the VMM UI, properties at the bottom that are specific to that application deployment. So finally, we'll switch over to my VMM system, and I'm going to walk you through a series of service templates from a single tier, single instance one that does no applications, just roles and features, all the way up to a 4-tier stock trader application that's sort of a Microsoft reference .NET application. So I have this blog engine service template, and I have 3 different versions of it. And the way I went about building up that service template is I started with version 1 being very basic. Right? So version 1, you can see there's no applications. There is a SQL Server deployment. And if I go ahead and look at the properties of this particular tier, in the OS configuration, it'll look very similar to VMM 2008 R2. The only big difference is, again, roles and features. So I've specified a number of roles that I require. I've specified a set of features that I require. And everything else is pretty much the same. And then I've attached a custom unattend. My application configuration, again, as you saw in this template designer, I don't deploy any applications with this version of the template. So there's no applications installed here, but I do have a couple scripts. So I can take this opportunity to show you what a custom resource looks like. So inside the VMM library, as I mentioned earlier, we ship default custom resources for Server App V and Web Deploy. And if I go ahead and pull out my library server, what you'll see is in the application frameworks directory, we have custom resources for Server App V and Web Deploy for x86 and x64 architectures. If I go back here, you'll see that the script resource package I'm using is the SAV x64 one. Now, inside that SAV x64 custom resource are a number of files. There's the setup files themselves, along with CMD files that we've made available that allow you to either install the sequencer or to install the Server App V agent itself. And the Server App V agent setup includes two optional parameters to also install Web Deploy, because if you've sequenced an IIS-based application with Server App V, that requires Web Deploy, and a /C to install the Server App V PowerShell command, should you want them installed as well. So this script is going to execute first. It's my pre-install script, and it's going to run CMD, and it's going to pass in /Q/C for quiet mode and suppress output. It's going to execute the CMD file and pass in a /W to also install Web Deploy. It's going to run as NT Authority system, but I could choose to run it as a domain account or maybe a local account that exists on the machine. And then the advanced settings really let me control what happens when this script executes. So I can specify things like, well, where do I want the payload delivered inside the VM? And we'll clean up the payload after we're done successfully installing, but maybe you want it in the Windows directory, not in our default payload directory. I can write standard output and standard error to a file, either on the machine or even on a network share, so that if something goes wrong, I can get access to what happened, standard out and standard error. I can also match standard out and standard error and exit codes and decide what I should do when I do match something. Do I warn and continue, or do I fail the task? I can decide to always restart the machine after the script is executed, so maybe I know it needs a reboot after executing, or if I can determine if it needs a reboot based on the exit code that's returned to me, I can go ahead and say, restart the machine if a particular exit code's returned, like a 1641, what have you. And after the computer's restarted, go ahead and restart the script, because maybe I have a reboot inside that script. That executes, the machine comes back up, and now I can finish executing that script. And then I have a post-install script, and what this one does is you can't, out of the box, sysprep SQL Management Studio into a prepared instance of SQL, and I always like Management Studio on my SQL servers, so I used a post-install script and wrote a very basic CMD file that will go ahead and install SQL Management Studio for me after the machine's been deployed. I'll show you the SQL Server configuration. So the disk I'm using for this template has a prepared instance of SQL. So what we'll allow you to do is tell us what was the instance ID that you prepared, and you know that from the time that you went through the SQL Prepare wizard. What is the instance name I want to have provisioned for me? I just chose the default, and I could add multiple SQL Server deployments if I needed to configure multiple SQL instances. Do I need a product key? And what's the installation run as account going to be? And then from a configuration perspective, SQL needs access to the SQL media to complete the installation. I chose to sysprep it into my disk. This could be available on a network share somewhere if you don't want to sysprep it into your disks. And if it is available on a network share, then you'd have to make sure that your installation run as account has access to that network share, or else the completion is going to fail. You can also specify the initial SQL Server administrators, security mode, again, mixed or Windows. If it is in mixed mode, what's the SA password going to be? And if you want TCP/IP and or named pipes enabled by default. And finally, I mentioned earlier the SQL Server configuration file, which we treat very much like our unattend file. Right? We'll merge those settings and apply them at specialization time. And finally, I can specify the service accounts identities for my core SQL Server services, like the SQL Server service, the agent service, and optionally the reporting service. So a deployment of this is just going to result in a machine that has SQL configured and a bunch of roles and features enabled, and it will have the Server App V agent and the Web Deploy framework already there. So I deployed an instance of that machine, and then I revved my template. So now I have a version 2.0 of the template. And what I did with this version is I added an application package. So if I zoom in here, you can see that it looks very similar, but now there's a blog engine Server App V package. If I pull open the properties and look at my application configuration, again, I have my same pre- and post-install script, but now I have a virtual application, a server app V package for Blog Engine. These are all the properties that server app V detected when I sequenced the Blog Engine application. One property, or a few interesting ones, are these default providers. These are in the Blog Engine web config, and Blog Engine can be deployed in a number of ways. The two most common ways are, one, it can use local XML files to store blog posts, so it doesn't actually require SQL. Second way is you can actually leverage SQL, and in which case, these three settings have to be, have values of DB blog provider, DB membership, and DB role provider. That tells Blog Engine it's leveraging a SQL database. And when you change them to DB, the other important thing to fill out is, of course, the data, right, the connection string. Now, I've left this as default in this version of the template because I know that this version of the template uses XML, so I don't have to worry about a connection string in this case. But after deploying my XML version, it turns out my developer has a new version of the package, and the XML file store is not as performant as we need it to be, so now they're going to wind up leveraging SQL. So I went ahead, copied that version of the template, gave it a version 3.0, and did a couple different things in this version of the template. First, you'll notice that there's a database that's been put into the template, right here, Blog Engine database. And if I open up the properties of this tier and go to the app config, first I'll start with Blog Engine. The first thing I did was, well, I know that it's now going to be using a DB, so I just hard-coded the values of these providers to DB blog provider. But the connection string, well, that's going to change depending on the environment into which I'm deploying. So I use this opportunity to specify a bunch of configurable service settings. Like I want to ask the end user for the SQL user that they're going to use, the password of the SQL user. And you'll note that I also used one of those built-in service settings that I spoke about earlier. Since I know that in this case I'm deploying SQL on the machine, I know that I'm using, I could have just did parentheses, local parentheses, but I wanted the computer name in the connection string. So I used our default @computer name @service setting, and VMM is going to fill that in at deployment time. The other interesting thing is, you'll notice that I specified variables, configurable service settings for SQL user and SQL password. And I'm using them to then populate my connection string. But the other thing I'm doing, when I deploy this data tier application, I'm also executing a T-SQL script to seed that Blog Engine database with a bunch of information, as well as with the SQL user and password. So if I open up the properties of this script, and I can execute multiple scripts for T-SQL and give them a deployment order. If I look at the properties, you can see that I'm passing in parameters to the T-SQL script, and they're the exact same parameters that I used for the connection string. So I'm going to ask the end user for a SQL username and a SQL password one time, but I'm actually using it in multiple places in the model, both as the connection string information as well as to this T-SQL script, which will go ahead and create that user and grant it the appropriate rights to this database after it's seeded the database with information. So the other service template that I wanted to show you, and I hope what you got from that one is, these things can be very simple, right? The first version of that template could have really just been an IIS server. And I'm just configuring a bunch of roles and features, maybe not even executing a script. Or if I was executing a script, maybe it was more of a system configuration script, not necessarily installing server app V or web deploy. But we can also have pretty complex service templates. And I'm going to pull up the stock trader one, which is a 4-tier application. I'll pull up version 1.0 of this. The only difference between 1.0 and 2.0 is 2.0 has some updated application packages. But the architecture of the app is the same in both cases. So this is a 4-tier application where I've actually specified application deployment orders. So I need my SQL tier up first. So it has application deployment order 1 because my web tier relies on that data tier being available. My web tier, so my front-end facing tier, is application deployment order 2. And then my mid tiers come up 3 and 4, or they both come up, 3 and 4. And you can see I'm deploying 5 databases into my data tier, 2 web deploy applications into my front-end tier, and a server app V application inside of each of my mid-tiers. My web tier is marked as a scale-out tier, and when I mark a tier as scale-out, I can specify the default instance count. So maybe I always want 2 instances by default. In this case, I just chose 1. I can specify a maximum instance count, minimum, and then, of course, upgrade domains. And again, upgrade domains just tell us how to service a particular tier. Question?
With the maximum instance count, is there any way to sort of
Question was, is there any way with the maximum instance count to model how many instances have been deployed in this tier across all of my stock trader deployments?
You're going to deploy one instance right now.
Mm-hmm.
You could go up to 5. And if you have 100 different services, you could go up to 5 across all 100. How are you going to know how much capacity you should plan?
Oh, so with our Ops Manager integration, we do have cloud capacity monitors that will warn you when you're 80% full or 90% full. You can use those. We also have some forecasting reports that go along with host capacity utilization and so forth. There's nothing built into the service model to do that, but our OM integration has some default monitors, some default rules that will go ahead and collect trending information for you. And again, if you have access to an analysis services server, we'll also do some forecasting reports for you based on the historical information we have. You could write your own Ops Manager rule to collect things like tier instance count as a performance counter. And where that would be useful is maybe it tells me at the end of every month I'm actually scaling up to 5 instances, but the rest of the month I'm really down at 1 or 2. So maybe I could plan ahead and proactively get those instances up and running instead of reactively getting them up and running based on monitoring data. So if I look at the properties of this particular tier, again, in the app config section, what I wanted to point out is I have a pre-install script that's going to execute before any applications are installed, and that's going to get the web deploy framework on the machine for me, and I know I need that because I'm deploying web deploy applications. But then for this particular web application, before it installs, I'm going to execute this CMD file that I wrote. All this does is it enables DTC because I know that this application needs DTC. So I execute this script, I install this web application, and then after this application's been installed, I execute this post-install script, and that enables some protocols that I need, opens up the firewall, and does some other activities. For application, so for global scripts, I have 4 entry points, pre-post install and pre-post uninstall. For application packages, however, I have some additional entry points. I have, of course, pre and post, but I also have pre-service and post-service entry points where I can execute scripts during servicing, and save state, restore state. Save state, restore state are interesting scripts for a scenario we call image-based servicing. There's a session on that tomorrow. I'll walk briefly through it in just a few minutes when I switch back to the deck. And then the save state and restore state scripts, I think, will become a little more clear. So that's a big collection of service templates from very simple to fairly complex, being stock trader, of course. I'm going to switch back to my deck. Question? The question was, is it possible to define affinity rules? I think you mean like fault domains, right? Like, I don't want all 4 of my web instances on a single host because my load balancer doesn't do me any good when that host goes down. The short answer is there's no first-class concept of fault domains in services. The longer answer is we have custom placement rules that are available in VMM 2012. Those are new. There's a session on that tomorrow at 4 o'clock that I'll be giving. And you could accomplish that by using custom placement rules to a large extent. Around fault domains in particular, though, it's something that we obviously recognize the need for and something we're talking about internally to possibly make available in future release. So it is something that we're definitely interested in. So the update process for a service, I mentioned this a few times. The way you update services is you copy your template, give it a new version, make your changes, and apply it. So you have your original service instance that was deployed, and it's referencing the service template from which it was deployed, including the version of that template. That has associated templates and packages and resources and so forth. What I do is maybe I get a new app package from my developer, or maybe I get a new disk with the latest patches that are all sysprepped in. I go ahead and copy my service template, give it a new version, new release, make my changes. I set my running service instance to point to the new version of the template. And again, I can choose to either apply immediately or choose to defer and have it applied during a maintenance window at some point in the future. Once my instance is ready for update, whether I do it immediately or whether I apply it later during my maintenance window, we go ahead and figure out the diff between the templates and only apply the changes. There's question? Rollback is setting that instance to a previous version of the template. And we'll go ahead and, again, maybe I enabled some new roles and features. Maybe I installed an updated application package. It didn't work. So I roll back. I get my old set of roles and features from the previous template as well as my old version of the package. And I'll actually do a rollback in my next demo because I have an update that's going to result in an error for the app. So I'll show you how easy it is to roll back. There's two update types that we have. One is called in-play. Question?
To follow on that question, can you automate both the deployment, the detection that the computer didn't work, and the rollback?
The question was, could you automate the detection that the deployment didn't work and roll back? Not native to VMM, but you could do that with Orchestrator because the outcome of the servicing operation will be either deployed OK or deployment failed or servicing failed. So you could detect the state of the updated service and then automatically initiate a reversion, automatically initiate a rollback to the previous template. So in-place updates means that we're going to make changes to the machines themselves. So if I've applied a new memory setting, if I've applied an updated application package, we're actually going to do those changes on the running instances of the machines in real time. The other type of update we have, and I'm not going to go in depth into this, and again, I'll have another session tomorrow that'll talk about image-based updates. It's tomorrow morning. But image-based updates actually allow you to replace the OS image during a servicing operation. So the scenario is, say I have my blog engine application, and I deployed it using Server 2008 R2 as my base VHD, and 6 months later I have a new VHD, and that VHD is Server 2008 R2 SP1. If I have an application that's amenable to image-based updates, and what I mean by amenable is it's either stateless or I know where the state is of that application, because again, we're going to reprovision the OS, so we need to be able to either have a stateless app or a way to carry that state forward during reprovisioning. What will happen is, I'll get to the workflow in just a second after in-place updating, we'll essentially replace the OS image, reinstall the application, and bring the state back. Now, for something like Server App V, lots of times I get asked a question, well, if Server App V just relies on web deploy for IIS-based applications, why wouldn't I just use web deploy? Why would I ever sequence an IIS-based application? The reason is Server App V will natively track and accrue the state of the application as it changes. So my blog engine application that's using local XML files, Server App V will recognize that those files are changing and will automatically save and restore state for Server App V applications during an image-based updating operation. For something like web deploy, that's where we give you the save state and restore state GCEs. So maybe you know where the state of your application is. It's not a Server App V-based application. You can write your own save state, restore state GCEs so that you could still allow that application to take advantage of image-based servicing. So in-place updating looks similar to deployment. We select a tier based on the servicing order, select a machine based on upgrade domain, if applicable. We'll go ahead and remove the machine from a load balancer, again, if applicable. We'll execute any pre-servicing GCEs you've identified. We'll apply any application level changes. We'll go ahead and apply any post-GCEs, should you have any. Uninstall application, install new application, right? Any of the changes that have been made in the template, return it to the load balancer, and then move on to the next tier in the servicing order. So servicing order is very similar to application deployment order, just tells us which tiers, the order in which we should service tiers. Image-based updating is very similar, with one big addition, which I just spoke about. When we remove the machine from the load balance, when we're getting ready to service it, what we do is we add a second data disk, or we add a new data disk to the machine. And we use that new data disk for the Server App V case, where we'll go ahead and automatically save and restore the state. So we add this data disk, we save off any Server App V state, we've swapped the OS disk, so we keep the virtual machine in place, we give it the new VHD that you specified, we re-specialize that VHD based on the guest OS profile settings and so forth, and then after that VHD has been customized, right, and the VM's been the VHD's been specialized, we'll go ahead and re-execute all the application installation and bring back any state. So for Server App V, again, we'll do it automatically. For web deploy application or your custom application that you wrote a save and restore state GCE, that's when we'll execute your restore state GCE to bring that back. And essentially what's happened is you've replaced the operating system underneath your application, and your application is back to the way it was before you did the image-based servicing operation. So I'm going to switch back to my demo machine, and I'm going to show you an instance of Blog Engine that's been deployed from that version 2.0 of the template. And as you'll recall, that uses local XML files for its storage. So So in my VMs and services view, it is this one here, the My Blog application. And just to show you, build on that screenshot from before, you can see that Blog Engine has been deployed. I get to see the application directly in my VMs and services view. And if you remember those settings, the connection string is just default because it's not using a SQL database in this version of the template. And those other three settings are all XML because it's using local XML files. If I log on to that machine, and I'm going to log on because I actually am going to purposefully generate an error during the deployment. And I want to show you what happens on the machine as well. This is my SQL directory. Clearly, there's no Blog Engine database in this directory. And this is what the Blog Engine app looks like using local XML stores. And you can note the top post, which just says, welcome to blogengine.net 1.6.0. So once the CLR spins up here and this application loads, I'm going to go ahead and service it from version 2.0 of the template to version 3.0, where I'm swapping from using XML files to using a SQL database and getting that database deployed and configured. So what I have in my VMs and services view is the ability to set template for a particular service instance. And I can either modify application settings, and I spoke about this earlier. Maybe I fat-fingered a connection string at deployment time. I don't want to have to redeploy the whole service. I could just go through this wizard, not apply a new template, and modify any of the application settings, the values for those settings that I specified at deployment time, and fix up my error. But in this case, I'm actually going to replace the current template, which is release 2.0, with the updated template. And you'll also notice when you saw my VMM library, I had lots and lots of service templates in there. But because we keep the lineage of those templates, I'm not presented with the ability to upgrade Blog Engine 2.0 to Stock Trader 3.0, right? That wouldn't make any sense. I'm only presented with a list of templates that have a lineage to the template from which this service is currently referencing. So I'm going to choose the version 3.0. And you remember I showed you in that service template that I had modeled SQL user and SQL password as configurable service settings. So I get prompted for those values over here. So I'm just going to give some values. And these values, again, are going to be used in two places. One, in that T-SQL script, and two, in that Blog Engine connection string. Now what we're doing is, this is where I get to specify the update method. So the default is in-place upgrade, so doing your changes on the currently running machines. And optionally, this is image-based servicing, deploy new virtual machine with updated settings. Image-based servicing takes a little while because you have to redeploy the whole VM, so I'm going to apply them in place. Now we're diffing the two service templates so that I can get a record of what we think has changed between the templates. And this is where I can choose to either apply the changes immediately or just set the service in a state that the settings can be applied at a later time, again, perhaps during a maintenance window. If I drill into my servicing tier, first it's going to tell me I'm doing conventional or in-place servicing. And I can see there's two main operations going on here. One, I have a new package that I've received from my developer. It's a Blog Engine 3.0 package. So we're going to upgrade Blog Engine 2.0 to 3.0. And we're also going to go ahead and install that Blog Engine DAC pack, that SQL database, the data tier application. So that looks good to me. I'm given a warning saying, hey, you only have a single upgrade domain, so it's possible that there is going to be an end-user impact, right? It's possible there's going to be an outage as part of doing this servicing operation. So that's fine with me. I have summary page. I click Finish. I'm going to switch over to the Jobs view real quick, and we'll see all the steps that take place. Because we're installing a new DAC pack and generating some other changes, this usually takes maybe a minute or a minute and a half. So if there's any questions, we can take those. But I'll also show you step by step sort of what's going on. So the first thing we did is we're updating the Server App V application. So the deploy file is the actual deployment of the physical Server App V package to the machine. And now we're updating the application. So we're replacing the 2.0 package with the updated 3.0 package. After that step completes, which it did, now we're moving on to the SQL DAC application. And you'll remember that I also had a T-SQL script. So we are pushing the DAC package over to that VM. We're registering it as a data tier application. And after that's done, we'll execute my SQL script, which also had those same values that were passed in for SQL user and SQL password. So my developers assured me that this has been tested thoroughly and everything should be working. So I've done my deployment, and I come in and I refresh the page because now it should look a little bit different. And sure enough, it absolutely looks different, right? But not in a good way. So he tells me, oh, I saw this before, right? You can just refresh a few times, and I think it'll start working. So I refresh a bunch of times, and it turns out that, oh, he's right, it does work, right? So you can see that the first post has changed. We're pointed back to a database now. And if I go into my VMs and services view, you see this package. First, I have a new data tier application. So we've deployed that, and it shows up immediately. I can also see my blog engine package, and you can see the settings have been changed to DB, which I modeled in my template. And also, you can see that the connection string now has actual connection string information into that database. So my dev says, OK, great, you refreshed it 5 or 6 times, it works, so let's just leave it deployed. But I actually don't like that because I'm now wondering what else can go wrong with the application. Do I expect my end users to refresh the home page 5 times before they can get to it? So I'm going to initiate a rollback to version 2.0 and tell them to get me a new package at some point in the future that's been better tested. So now I have the opportunity to set template. And again, I'm going to browse, and I'm going to go back to version 2.0. And now what we're telling you is, hey, you had these settings that were defined in version 3.0 of the template, but they're not defined in version 2.0, so we're going to be deleting them, right? The settings aren't available anymore. So I say, that's fine. Again, I'm going to update in place. And I'm going to choose to update immediately. And if I look again here, what we're doing now is uninstalling that DAC pack, and we're updating the blog engine app from 3.0 to 2.0. So before I do that, I also wanted to show you inside of that virtual machine the SQL directory. Now you can see we do have the blog engine database. So it was deployed. It was pushed there. You can see the timestamp on it. And back in VMM, I'm now going to revert from version 3.0 to version 2.0. If I go back and look at my job trail again, we'll have a very similar set of steps. This one usually is a little shorter than the other one, because I guess deleting things are easier than creating things. So we're updating the server app V application. We've deployed the file there already. We're going again from version 3.0 to version 2.0. And then we're going to go ahead and uninstall the DAC package. And if I look at the virtual machine, we should just see the blog. So it just disappeared. So we uninstalled the DAC. And my uninstall option that I specified in my template was to delete the database. I could choose to just make it unmanaged or just drop it, but I actually chose the delete option. So that job should be done. Again, I just get a warning that, hey, you had a single upgrade domain. There could have been an outage. And if I go back to that blog engine page and do a hard refresh, I should be back to where I was prior to doing the servicing operation. And you can see the first post has changed. My DAC packs are gone. I'm back to the state I was in before servicing it to 3.0. Question?
If you had lost settings going from 2 to 3, would they prompt again, or would they just go ahead and push back?
Yes, so the question was, if I now went back to 3.0, would I have to specify those settings again? Yeah, so yes, I would, because we're retaining settings for the current version of the instance out there, and if there's no settings on this version, we delete, we don't store them. So if I upgraded to 3.0, I'd have to specify again a SQL username and password. But if I went from 3.0 to 4.0 and all that changed was an application package update that had the same settings, you won't get reprompted for settings. We store those values. But we will give you the opportunity to change them during servicing if you want to. So maybe my connection string changed. Maybe I have a password policy on my SQL accounts that their password changes every 90 days. So I could go through the servicing wizard and change the value of those settings, and we'll apply them through the model. I'm sorry?
Similar to the SQL scenario where...
Oh, can you deploy web deploy applications out to like a web application host? We've heard the feedback in 2012 RTM, no. We only have SQL application host type. But we are, web application host is one of the new application host types that we've been discussing and is one that we would like to do at some point. Because that, again, common scenario, right? I have a web farm, and that web farm hosts hundreds of applications. I want to be able to model my service such that my web deploy application goes to a shared web farm, and my data tier application goes to a shared SQL cluster. So from VMM 2008 R2, I'm sure everyone is very familiar with refreshers that we have in the system. So we have host refreshers and VM refreshers that run periodically to get the current state of a host, get metrics about a host. Same thing for virtual machines. We built a new refresher for services. We call it a service level refresher. And what it does is it will identify machines that may have gone missing from the service or machines that are in a bad state. And it really supports only 2 states. It's either OK or needs attention. And if it needs attention, we rely on you drilling in to that view in the VMs and services view to see which tier has a problem and which particular VM or VMs have a problem. And your VM refresher state will indicate the actual source of the problem. We also have actions that are enabled at 3 different levels. So for the service as a whole, we give you some simple actions like stop. And what that means is stop all the VMs in the service, or delete, which means delete all the VMs in the service and delete the service itself. Pause, resume, shut down, and so forth. At the tier level, we have a scale-out wizard, and I'll walk through that in the last demo, that enables you to go ahead and scale out a particular tier. And finally, there are things that we still ask that you do at the VM level. So things like checkpoint a VM, or deploy or store a VM to or from the library. Scale in, I mentioned earlier, is a manual activity at the VM. It's really just a VM deletion. You could, of course, use PowerShell if you wanted to checkpoint the service by getting all the VMs in the service and doing a checkpoint operation on all of them. We just didn't expose certain actions at the service level. So I'll switch back to my system one more time, and then we'll have some time for questions as well. And for any particular service, I can take a tier, like my stock trader production service that has a web tier with one machine, and either from PowerShell or from the UI, I have access to a scale-out wizard, a scale-out action, and that's going to launch a new wizard that we have. So I, again, confirm the tier that I want to scale out. It is my web tier. I get to see the current count and minimum and maximum, and also what the pattern is. So for computer names, you can use simple patterns. In this case, I've chosen st5 web ###, which means VMM is going to automatically generate and keep track of computer names. So the first one that gets deployed would be st5 web 001, and then 002, 003, and so forth. And it will reclaim names upon VM deletion as well. What we will not do, and it's important to remember this, is validate that that name is available for use in Active Directory. So if you already have a machine that's called st5 web 001 that VMM is not managing, we're not going to know about that, and we're going to actually have a conflict. So it's important just to keep that in mind in your naming patterns, and also existing machines that might be out in the environment, particularly ones that are not managed by your VMM system. So I get to specify the VM name. If I don't, I can leave it blank, and we'll just generate the VM name so that it matches the computer name that we wind up generating for you. So I almost always leave mine blank. I get to configure some settings about the VM once I get to the next page. Very few. So do I want to accept the generated computer name or customize that computer name? And then I can specify the actions for the VM, very similar to a standalone VM. Finally, I get a summary, and I can click Scale Out. I could also, like almost every VMM wizard and dialog, get the PowerShell script if I wanted to automate Scale Out via an Ops Manager remediation or something like Orchestrator to have automated Scale Out based on performance counters or certain condition detection. This script gives me a really good platform from which to generate automated Scale Out actions. So I'm just going to cancel out of that wizard, and I believe that's the last slide that I have, so I'm happy to take more questions. Oh, I want to point these two out. So I mentioned these earlier. Early in the morning, and it is early, 8:30 in the morning, I don't know how I got signed up for it, is a maintenance and updates to service and hypervisor infrastructure talk. And it's really going to be divided into 2 sections. The first section is going to be about our Hyper-V host patching story and how we do orchestrated cluster patching of not only Hyper-V hosts, but also VMM infrastructure components like library servers. But we're also going to go in depth into in-place servicing, not so much different from what you saw today, but we're going to cover image-based updating in more depth, walking through the workflow a little bit, and also show you this updated disk resources workflow that we have. What that is in a nutshell, maybe it will tempt you to get up for an 8:30 session, is when I add VHDs, virtual disks, into my VMM library, I can tag them with a name and release, a family and release. So you can imagine that I may have a Server 2008 R2 family of VHDs, and my release is 1.0. And maybe 6 months later, again, I have an SP1 that I've built for that, right? So now I have a new image. I drop it in my library. I give it the same family, Windows Server 2008 R2, but a different release. Maybe it's release 2.0, or maybe I call the release SP1. Now, we'll go through automatically, and we'll find all the service templates that reference the original disk. And we'll mark the service templates in an outdated status. When they're marked in an outdated status, we give you a new option called Copy and Update. We'll copy that, if you choose to do that, we'll copy the service template, swap the OS disk that that template's pointing to, and then and then allow you to publish the updated template. When you publish the updated template, service owners will see that their service instance goes to an outdated state, and they can view the notifications associated with it and decide whether or not they want to go through, say, an image-based servicing operation to get their service into a compliant state or get it pointed to the right disk going forward. And I'm going to walk through that whole workflow tomorrow in that session. Tomorrow afternoon, right before the party, is a session where we're going to cover things that we don't really talk about in lots of other sessions, but things that are still really important. We're going to talk about library equivalency and placement and power optimization and dynamic optimization, but from a services perspective, we're going to go in depth into import-export, and we're also going to go through our Ops Manager integration, which is a great feature not only for metrics and performance reporting and trending and all that great stuff, but what we do when you have Ops Manager configuration enabled is whenever you deploy an instance of a service, we automatically push that service object over into OM as a read-only distributed application, which means that you have at any given point in time an accurate representation of the virtual machines that contribute to delivering that business service. Prior to working at Microsoft, I worked at a large enterprise, and I just remember over and over we'd have an issue with an application. And the first thing that happened was you got 20 people into a room, we used to call it the war room, and you spent 20 minutes with 20 people diagramming out the application and all the components and the servers that contribute to it. And inevitably someone speaks up and says, well, no, we removed that server like 2 weeks ago, and someone else speaks up and says, yeah, and we added these 2 new servers a week ago. And it takes you forever just to establish an accurate view of the VMs or the servers that contribute to the application. If you do a scale-out operation, if you do a deletion, if you do a new deployment, we immediately push that information into Ops Manager. I mean, it's available in seconds. So when I do a scale-out, that new machine will pop up in an under creation state. So I can always go to that diagram view and get an accurate picture of what VMs contribute to what tiers of what service. Question?
On the subject of Operations Manager integration, how do you envision the maintenance modes?
So with our Ops Manager integration in 2012, we built the ability also to integrate maintenance mode. So when I put something in maintenance mode in VMM, and really that's just my hosts, hosts have maintenance mode property associated with them, we'll mark them in maintenance mode in OM. The direction is one way, so if I take it out of maintenance mode in OM or put it in maintenance mode in OM, it won't be reflected in VMM. What we do is, since we know that we control that maintenance mode operation, either for cluster patching or because an admin has put it in maintenance mode, we'll mark it in maintenance mode for the maximum allowable time, which I think is 2 years by default. And when you take it out of maintenance mode in VMM, we'll take it out of maintenance mode in OM. And you can either enable or disable that feature. So when you integrate with Ops Manager, we give you the option, and even for an ongoing connection, to say, yes, I want maintenance mode integration, or no, I don't want maintenance mode integration. Question?
Yeah, is there any support for cross-platform, so when you service?
So the question was, is there any support for cross-platform in the Service Designer? The answer is yes. You can drop Linux VMs into your Service Designer and get them deployed. You could scale out a Linux tier, but none of our in-guest configuration options apply to Linux, right? So you can't execute custom scripts, you can't attach an app profile, but you can absolutely include a Linux machine in a tier. And again, you can do scale out on it, which just means, deploy another machine for the tier. And I think that Greg Cosenza has a session tomorrow on managing multiple hypervisors, where he has a service template that has a Linux tier in it as well. And please do complete your evaluation. We absolutely read them. Love the feedback. Again, really appreciate you taking the time to come to the session. I hope you learned something. I hope you have some great ideas on how to use service templates going forward. And I hope next time you're at a conference and someone asks how many people are familiar with service templates, like every hand goes up. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the conference.